Hello, and welcome to a very special time zone broadcast. We're here at one of the spookiest locations we could think of to tell you about some very interesting tales that we've found in our research. We hope you enjoy this. We've missed you all, and happy Halloween. Somewhere very close to this site lies the grave of Thomas Scammell. And Thomas Scammell has been a person who I've been researching for years now, good 5-6 years, and his tale gets never more interesting than when we hear of his fate. It's difficult. I don't like sharing his tale because it kind of feels like my own personal research project. I've been working on it for so long, times in libraries, but I'm going to give you a little bit of the taste of the tale of Thomas Scammell right now. Thomas Scammell was born in 1840. A Salisbury resident, a local boy made good, a real success story. In 1840, he's recorded as being a very low stock, to be fair. He comes from a family of brickmakers. He himself becomes a brickmaker, and he works his way up to the very heights of society. How he does it might not actually be as clear-cut as I first thought, and finding this out has been quite a journey for myself, and I'd like to share it with you, or at least some of it. So, Thomas Scammell, by the time he's 21, he's become a brickmaker himself. By the time he's 31, recorded in the census as being a shopkeeper. And this is where the big change happens. As a shopkeeper, he has access to quite a bit of money and good contacts, and he manages to make the business deal of his life. Him and some colleagues managed to purchase what was Fisherton Jail. Now, Fisherton Jail was a vast site. In fact, it was a county jail, and it lies almost exactly where St Paul's Roundabout is now. In 1870, the jail was no longer useful. It wasn't in the right place, it wasn't great conditions, and somebody needed to take over the site. And in steps Thomas Scammell and his friends, Stephen B, and they basically make a huge amount of money by buying this property. At first, I thought they bought it outright for £6,305, because that's what the record says. But a lot of research shows that they actually paid it on easy terms, pretty much finance. They paid £100 or so every month. And as they gathered more and more of this property and acquired more land, they started building houses. Many people watching may live in those houses. I myself used to live in one of Scammell's houses, and that's kind of how I came across this tale. If you live anywhere close to the Duke of York, you'll find that the terraced houses there were built by Thomas Scammell and his friends on the old jail grounds. Slowly but surely, he built a vast empire of terraced houses, mainly rentals, a big income. Such was his ego that he named a lot of the streets after his family. Sydney Street, James Street, to name just a few, are all directly named after his kids. Thomas Scammell becomes a very, very rich man, and looking through the census, you can see this very clearly. He goes from being a brickmaker, a grocer, to a master builder, to a man living by his own means at Avon House. Now, Avon House is actually a garage now, but if you were to visit the Duke of York and look straight down towards where Waitrose nestles now, that garage there used to be a vast house, which was, in fact, Thomas's place of residence. Now, Thomas was a very shrewd businessman. He managed to get vast swathes of Salisbury under his control and build on them. Famously, Scammell's Bridge, which was a scandal in itself, which I could probably go on to about for ages. But ultimately, Wyndham Road owes its entire existence, really, to Scammell's endeavours, because through his patronage, through his entrepreneurialism, he manages to buy Nelson Road itself and convince the local almshouse to allow access. It basically cuts out a huge amount of the journey from Wyndham Road to the train station, which meant the houses were worth a vast amount of money compared to what they were before. Now, the rather sad thing is that as this bridge was built, just a couple of days before it was opened, to much public excitement, he opened it with a toll booth in place, which meant local residents all of a sudden had to pay for the privilege of using this wonderful bridge that Mr. Scammell had put in place. He made quite a lot of money, and the toll booth was running until 1927, if I remember correctly. And that's another story in itself. But Mr. Scammell, this lovely chap who's a Liberal councillor and then a Conservative councillor, head of the local Conservative club, a Freemason, a very well-respected man. Or so you'd think, until you start digging into the records, which I have done And there's a lot of court cases involving Mr. Scammell. Mr. Scammell was a violent man. He was an angry man. And if you were working for him and you did something that he wasn't happy with, you'd be off the job before you knew it. I found several articles reporting to him actually assaulting people who were working for him and being fined for it. But the tragic thing and the curious thing about Thomas Scammell is the end of his life. And very few people seem to know this tale. So, in 1903, Thomas Scammell was found on the railway line, very close to his house, near Waitrose now. The sinister thing was that his body was one side of the train track and his head was found the other. Now, that's a pretty tragic accident, surely. That must be what it is. But it's a bit more sinister than that. His body was found halfway down a train that had been nestled there for some time. He was buried the next day, which I always found quite strange, and I managed to find the inquest and the coroner's report. When the coroner was directly asked, did anyone have any malice towards Mr. Scammell, his son Charles Scammell replied, no. Everyone thought he was a lovely chap, or words to those effect. And then they asked, is it possible that Mr. Scammell could have been dead before he was placed upon the railway tracks? Could he have been murdered? To which they answered, no. He was such a fine fellow, everyone thought so much of him. And the coroner agreed and returned an open verdict. Thomas Scammell left £26,000 in his will. Surely somebody had it in for Thomas Scammell. I've got a fairly good idea who. I'd love to tell you sometime.
I'm stood here at the grave of the Reverend Edward Leigh King, who was one of the victims in the 1906 Salisbury rail disaster. On that night, the boat train express was travelling from Plymouth to Waterloo. It approached Salisbury train station where there is a terrible curve. No one will ever know why the train took that curve at the speed it did. But it was too fast, resulting in a terrible derailment. 28 people died that night, mainly Americans. One Canadian who is buried here in this grave, the Reverend King. Because there were so many people dead in Salisbury train station, the ladies' waiting room had to be turned into a makeshift mortuary. It is said to this day that that mortuary is haunted. It presented quite a problem for the rail authorities because the victims were mainly Americans. Somehow they had to be shipped back to the United States for burial. Embalmers were brought up from Southampton, where they produced wooden lead-lined coffins. These were then shipped to London and eventually back to America. However, only one person was buried in Salisbury, and that was the Reverend Leigh King. All the citizens of Salisbury and Fisherton Street, where the funeral went down Fisherton Street towards Salisbury Cathedral for a state service, all the windows and blinds were drawn. Salisbury wanted to pay its respects to the Reverend Leigh King. A recently found photograph showing this very grave has turned up. It shows all the dignitaries who came to Devizes Road Cemetery. To the centre left of the photograph, there's a very tall gentleman. This is Chief Constable Frank Richardson, and 2 years later, he'd be back at his very graveyard at the burial of the murdered 12-year-old schoolboy, Teddy Haskell.
This is the grave of 12-year-old Teddy Haskell, who was found murdered in his bed on the night of the 31st of October 1908. Teddy, who lived with his mother Flora at 40 Meadow Road, was found with his throat cut ear to ear. It was a Saturday night. The inquest was set for the following Tuesday, the 3rd of November. And Chief Inspector Dew from London Scotland Yard, Inspector Richardson of Salisbury Police Force, and the coroner went down to Meadow Road where Teddy's body still lay in situ. When they came back in a completely surprise move, they arrested Teddy's mother Flora for the murder. So the funeral was set for the next day, the Wednesday, and instead of poor Flora walking down with the funeral cortege, she was taken to the Guildhall, to the court, and charged with Teddy's murder. It was meant to be a secret, but the news had somehow got out and hundreds of people flocked the Guildhall square. After they'd seen Flora almost carried into the court, they went down to Meadow Road to see Teddy's body loaded onto a glass-fronted hearse. The hearse was pulled by black horses with plumes, and the sad procession went up Devizes Road up here to the cemetery. It was meant to be a private ceremony, but there was a crowd of about 100 people. The mayor was here, there were the local councillors, and about a dozen of Teddy's school friends. The school friends were carrying white chrysanthemums and they laid them on Teddy's grave. I don't have any white chrysanthemums, but flowers from my garden for Teddy. Teddy was a keen footballer. Although he only had one leg, he played for his local schoolboy team in goal. Salisbury football team sent a wreath in the shape of a football to lay upon the grave. But the big question remains, did Teddy's mother Flora murder her son? Well, after 2 trials, she was found not guilty for lack of evidence, and I have found that there was, in fact, a contemporary suspect called John Ray. I've looked into John Ray, and I think that he is a very possible candidate for the murder of Teddy Haskell. But I'll be telling you all about that in a future documentary.